And what a fantastic event so far. And now we kick off the first ever Innovation Summit during the Acquisition Research Symposium. I can't think of a better way to begin the Innovation Summit other than to have two leaders at the forefront of acquisition change, but from different perspectives. One leading acquisition reform from an educational and research perspective, and one leading acquisition reform from an execution, technology transition, and delivery of capability perspective. I am proud to welcome back Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, NPS President, and to introduce Mr. Doug Beck, Director of Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, and Principal Staff Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, for a fireside chat about the current state of DoD acquisition reform. Please welcome these two Navy veterans, scholars, and DoD innovation leaders.
Bob, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you and your team for what they've done in these last several years with the acquisition, research, and education that we do at NPS, and now the extraordinary privilege of being able to talk with Mr. Doug Beck, who is the director of the Defense Innovation Unit. Doug, a very fine good morning to
Morning, Ann.
you.
How are you?
And thank you so much for being here. You're a man under extraordinary stress and popularity, I must say. I must say. But for the audience, for all of you who are on, and Doug, I want you to know something, that we have about 1,500 people that are subscribed to this entire ARP. So I'm sure that as many as can are listening to you today. What I wanted to share with the audience is Doug is, first of all, an extraordinary mind and leader. His sense of wanting to move forward is absolutely part of who he is. And it's important to know that because it's been seen by others. So prior to coming to DoD as the DIU lead, he worked directly for Tim Cook at Apple. And he and I had a number of terrific visits when he was in that job. Now he is working very directly also now for the Secretary of Defense, and he in both cases had direct and has direct reporting obligations to each leader. But before all of that, and even during all of that, Doug has served in our Navy. He is an intelligence officer in the Naval Reserves. He served with special operations, one tour in Iraq and two in Afghanistan. So this is a man who thinks, who acts, who leads, and who has had to be innovative in many different ways. So he is the perfect leader for DIU. So Doug, again, welcome. You know, you were at the birth of DIU almost 10 years ago, Doug, and you now have been the leader and the director for over 2 years in kind of a DIU 2.0 or 3.0. But how has the mission of DIU evolved over time? And it will be fluid. And then where do you think DIU is heading? And what do you think of the lessons learned to make it even better?
So thank you, Ann. And first of all, I want to thank you for having me here today, and also for your incredible record of service, both in uniform and now in your current role at the Naval Postgraduate School. So thanks for your leadership and your commitment, and also your teamwork. So, you know, as you mentioned, I kind of come at this problem with three lenses. So I've been in the department here for about 2 years. My birthday was just a couple weeks ago, but before that, I spent 13 years, as you said, working directly for Tim at Apple, but I've spent about double that amount of time. Actually, a little more than that. My 28th birthday with the Navy is coming up here pretty soon. in and out of uniform. And with both those hats on, I've spent a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific. So as you mentioned, I spent a lot of time in with special operations, and most of my career with the Navy has been focused on the Indo-Pacific region, except for the times I've been doing counterterrorism uh, and in my civilian career as well, a lot of my life and career has been focused on the Indo-Pacific and living and working out in that region. And so with kind of all of those hats on, I did have the privilege of being there kind of at the birth of DIU, then X, when we kind of got started, and have had a chance to kind of participate along the way in the journey. And so if we step back, Secretary Ash Carter was truly prescient in seeing the incredible need. And I will say he was building on ideas that came from two naval officers around this and helping to push on this space in the form of, at the time, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, and also Cybercom/NSA Director, Admiral Rogers. And those two folks had a lot of very critical ideas in the space. And Secretary Carter was truly prescient in seeing that there was no way that we could meet the strategic imperative facing our nation. And he was already very focused on the challenge from the People's Republic of China, as well as the other challenges around the world, but particularly for the challenge to the People's Republic of China, and how even at that point in time, now from the early days of thinking about this over 10 years ago, where that already was, and that we couldn't meet those challenges unless we harnessed the incredible power of our commercial tech sector, commercially derived tech sector. Now, it's ironic that that the Silicon Valley, where I kind of grew up professionally in many ways, that we're all used to, that Silicon Valley really came out of the intersection of the private sector, the public sector, and academia around the support of national security, first during the Second World War and then throughout the Cold War. And that's really what built Silicon Valley. In fact, Apple Park, where I worked before I came into government a couple of years ago, is literally built on top of the site of the old HP Advanced Projects campus, which was focused on that part of Hewlett Packard's energy in this technology space. And so today's innovation really rests literally on the shoulders of that. But we had completely lost, frankly, that intersection 10 years ago. These two worlds couldn't even talk to each other. And that was crazy, because if you think about what's changed and what had changed versus a few generations before, where a lot of the technology that we were seeing the world was advancing most quickly in those defense-oriented pathways, and that's where many inventions of things like GPS, the internet, came from, that we were already 10 years ago in a world where in 11 of the 14 critical areas of technology that we track as a department that are central to military capability, that those areas of technology, areas like AI, autonomy, space, biotech, energy, et cetera, were advancing far more quickly in order to meet the relentless demands of billions of consumers around the world and the enterprises that serve them than they ever could in meeting our defense-only bespoke needs. And that was true and was always gonna be true. And so as a result, we must find a way to harness both, right? We have to continue to drive those often highly classified, bespoke areas of innovation, sometimes that take 5 or 10 or 15 years to execute on, because we have to literally go from applied science, in some case, generate the applied science all the way to capability. And that's not the part of the puzzle that DIU works on. And at the same time, we've got to harness that commercially derived technology. It's not necessarily all dual use, but it's taking those capabilities from those areas where the commercial world is pushing the bounds and harness that for our needs. And that's really what DIU is all about. So at the beginning, DIUX was focused, just to kind of answer your question on the journey, was focused really on building that bridge or rebuilding that bridge kind of at all. And in the early days, and I was there first as a civilian advisor, and then as the leader of the Joint Reserve component for DIU while I was over at Apple in my day job, was really about could we bring these two groups together? And the metric was how many meetings could we have, and would anybody show up, and did anybody see any value in those meetings? And the answer very often was no. They won't come, or they don't see any value in being there. And obviously we are now light years past that, right? The level of sophistication that we have in the department, with every senior leader understanding the criticality of this intersection, is and it's universal, right? We couldn't be further from where we were on this 10 years ago. And in the commercial tech world, there are now many companies, founders, and many investors, many of whom actually are veterans themselves, who are very focused on this space. So we're a light year past where we were in what I would call DIU 1.0. DIU 2.0, which is really where two of my key predecessors, Raj Shah and then Mike Brown, both focused on really building, was proving that you could take real military problems, and you could take real commercially derived tech, and you could actually deliver against those real problems using other transaction authorities that were already on the books, but that we as a department didn't know how to use, at least in this space, and that you could put a prototype into the hands of the warfighter in weeks or months as opposed to 5 or 10 years, and that could be done. And at the time, that was a revolutionary concept. DIU's now done it many times. And other organizations around the department have sprung up in order to do much the same thing. And that is fantastic, but it's not good enough. And that's why we need to really take it to the next step. So what we have to do now is take that capability and apply it for strategic effect, which really means two things. First, it's about focusing it on those most critical problems, those critical operational capability gaps that we must solve for in order to deter major conflict, or win if we are forced to fight. And then it's about scaling those capabilities so that they can deliver that strategic effect. We need that scale for strategic impact in the department, and the tech sector needs that scale to make the ROI work, so that the flywheel of American dynamism can support this, and we can unlock the billions and billions of dollars of investment that are out there. And doing that in order to deter major conflict or win if forced to fight is what DIU 3.0 is all about. And that is really a different game. That's why Secretary Austin first elevated DIU to be a direct report at the same time that I came into the job. That's why Congress then stepped up, first in the NDAA and on the authorizer side, made DIU a principal staff assistant to the secretary at the same level as the undersecretaries of defense. So we're around the table, and then stepped in again with a significantly enhanced budget and in order to deliver on that, or help to deliver on it. That's what we've been after for the last couple of years. And what Secretary Hegseth is now doing is pushing on helping us to take that even to the next level and accelerating and scaling that capability. And we must, because I'll come back to that imperative that Secretary Carter was prescient in seeing. It is now. It isn't in 5 years. It isn't in 10 years. And we're all tracking the statements that Xi Jinping has made about 2027. That's a critical date and time, but it's just a date and time. The challenge is, and the threat is right now. It starts right now, and every single day that goes by, that risk goes up until we put the capability in place to take that risk down. So that's what we're focused on doing. We're focused on doing it with focus, speed, and scale.
What a wonderful and masterful walk through the DIU legacy, the history, the DNA, and where it is. And it makes sense as organizations evolve. So it's kind of always trying to respond to the need at the time. If I may, you made a comment about the conversation at first, a lot of meetings and a lot of talking. But I do think that as the evolution of DIU went along, those conversations did change. And it sounds like what you're saying is that at first it was just kind of the big idea that Carter had posed for everybody, and I remember the time that he did that. But then along the way, every SecDef since then has just further matured that conversation. How would you describe the conversation that is the most useful and productive under DIU 3.0?
Yeah, so I think the core of this really gets at the core of what we're doing in that strategy, and I'll just quickly run through like what the key lines of effort, and then I want to double down on the kind of the what I think is in some ways the most critical part of that,
Yeah,
which is exactly where you were going. So we've got 5 main lines of effort that we're focused on. The first is about embedding deeply with the warfighter at the combatant commands and with the services in order to ensure that we're focused on those most critical gaps. Second is about working with the true engines of scale of the department to help to ensure that we can reach the scale. The third is about catalyzing that diverse community of entities out there into a cohesive community of entities as a team. The fourth is about taking the partnership with the commercial tech sector to the next level and continuing to push the bounds on that, from early startup all the way to those who are now gaining in scale in working with the department. And the fifth is about international allies and partners and how we partner with our teammates around the world to further this part of the fight, in preparing or deterring the actual fight. And so those are really the kind of 5 key pieces. So what I want to do is maybe part of where that conversation has really changed is on the first 2 things that I talked about, which is really about partnership with the services and the combatant commands, and taking that to a completely different level. And this is really something that I think the combination of the maturity of understanding of senior leaders across the department with the change in my role and my ability to be kind of around the table and partners with the leadership of both combatant commands and services, combined with actually the fact that the budget, both its scale and its nature, has really kind of changed the game. So maybe let me drill in on that a little bit. First, I'll talk a little bit about the combatant command services. That partnership on focus is really the start of this. And where we focus at DIU is if you imagine a 2x2 matrix, which I apologize, once upon a time in an earlier life, I was a partner in a consulting firm, so I can't help but think in 2x2 matrices. If you put on the y-axis sort of strategic impact, and then you put on the x-axis where DIU is the National Mission Force for Innovation, effectively is most focused on helping to drive and is best positioned for the department to drive. We're focused in the upper right-hand corner on executing on those things, and then things that may be strategic, but we're not the best to do it, or we're focused on helping others do it or get out of the way. If it's strategic, we're the only ones who can do it. We got to help other people learn how to fish so they can take care of it and we get out of the way. We got to focus in the upper right hand corner. And that really starts with understanding the most critical warfighter needs. So for example, what are the things that keep Admiral Paparo up at night? And what can we do now to put capability in place to change that equation? And so that really starts with being at that table and in conversation constantly, and not just conversation, but in action together. And so one of the things that we've done is we've got embeds now from DIU at the combatant commands. So starting with Indo-PACOM, for example, where Admiral Paparo's lead for commercial tech, who's actually right down the hallway right now. I happen to be at one of the we're visiting a company together, so I'm doing this from that site. I'm with Admiral Paparo's J8 and our embed, who is simultaneously Admiral Paparo's commercial technology lead, and our embed with him, as well as my AI tech lead for DIU. That allows us to be constantly at a point of intersection so that we can both help to shape the way that INDOPACOM is thinking about where commercial tech can help make a difference to those critical problems. And then second, be in a position to ensure that we're prioritizing those things and then helping deliver on them concretely and doing it now, in partnership with the service so things can sail. And that really starts with those embeds. And so we're INDOPACOM, we're also, UCOM, the Security Assistance Group Ukraine's science technology lead is a DIU embed. And so we're doing this kind of across the departments in order to ensure that we're able to really focus on those most critical needs. The second piece of this is really about scale, right? Because and that really is about partnership with the services who are the true engines of scale for the department, as well as those of the joint staff and others in OSD who help to make that happen. And that partnership has really been a pretty critical piece here. DIU always had a kind of gating factor on our work of a transition partner is what we called it.
Yeah.
And that's good, but it's not good enough. Because now if there's not a pathway to scale, which doesn't mean it's all locked in with detail in the POM process with everything, every I dotted and T crossed, because then we wouldn't be different. But it does mean that I'm looking across the table at, for example, CNO, or the Chief of Staff of the Army, or SecNav, and the under, and saying, okay, are those things that we're focused on things that the service also believes need to be focused on, and the service is prepared to help scale so that we can work together on ensuring from an acquisition standpoint, prototype goes to fielding, goes to scale, and ultimately impact where it makes sense. And also simultaneously that all the other critical aspects of man, train, and equip are happening, right? So that all that .mil PFP is happening so that at the end of the day, you don't just have stuff, you have capability that can deliver that strategic impact. That's about partnership. And so when we go through our budget, we do that prioritization on the 2x2 that I've talked about, and we literally sit down with the leadership of the service and say, this is the 2x2 as it corresponds with your focus. Is this right? Having already done that 2x2, for example, with Admiral Paparo on, is this right? And where that intersection happens is where we focus, because that's the sweet spot of focus and speed and scale.
So you talked earlier about the fact that defense is looking at all of this and innovation from the point of view of scaling and capability, and business is also going to be looking at it through ROI. I mean, it's two different sets of metrics. But you talked about the intersection of and the integration of defense innovation and acquisition, and all of that also has two kinds of definitions of risk, both for DoD and for business. So how do you help us to think about risk as we integrate, we intersect, we partner? How do you talk about risk to the two different big parties, industry and the DoD?
So this is it's a great topic and a critical one. I'm glad you're asking about that. I think we need a pretty fundamental change in the way that we think about risk in the department, and this is something that's actually very, very, very comfortable and understood more kind of in the tech sector. And the key here is we've got to go from I came home from, you mentioned that I'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I came home from those experiences with really an understanding that most of what I'd spent my entire career in the private sector thinking of as risk, and I'd actually helped to design risk tools and processes and capabilities in both the kind of B2B universe and the B2C universe. And most of what I thought about as risk really wasn't, right? It was uncertainty, because risk is risk to mission, risk to force, and strategic risk for our nation. And so if you take that lesson and you apply it into what we do in the Defense Department, we have to be able, both in the department and in our intersection with Congress to change the dynamic so that we are prepared to take the right kinds of risks, right? Process risk, financial risk, reputational risk, where we might look stupid, so that we can avoid taking the wrong kind of risk, which is risk to mission, risk to force, and strategic risk. And too much of our processes are set up to and incentives are set up to layer on all the ways to protect against the first set of little r risks, and as a result, dramatically increase how much big R real risk we're taking on. And that's the thing that I think we've got to change.
How do you think about risk in that sense? I mean, it's you gave a terrific sense of definition and perspective. How do you think about that in terms of speed and pace? Because on the one hand, there's risk to not having speed and pace. On the other hand, there's risk to having speed and pace. How is DIU having that conversation?
Well, I mean, I think actually, maybe I'll kind of back up a little bit and talk a little bit about because I think there's some piece of this that have to do with how we reform or restructure the kind of whole defense procurement system. And I'd love to come back and talk about that. Maybe I'll drill in just a second on
Sure,
the unique
sure.
budget that DIU's
Yeah,
been given and how we use that to help kind of get after that. Um, so Congress did step in and give us this enhanced budget, which is, was about 8x or so more than was there before, and it may be the most talked about 0.1%
yeah,
out there. But what I think is actually most powerful there is not the scale of that budget, although that is critical, and obviously we deeply appreciate the trust it represents from the Congress and the people. But really, what's changed is kind of the colorless nature of that money
right.
that allows us to go all the way from initial idea all the way to initial fielding, which allows us to help the department to take on risk in a very, very different way. And so that flexible funding has transformed our relationship with the services in some pretty critical ways. Because what that allows us to do is now start with an idea and kind of a prototype and go kind of all the way through. So let me describe how that works, and I'll give you a concrete example around with the Navy around the large diameter UUV. So this, for example, goes back in not long after I came into this job. The Navy asked DIU to step in and help with a with an LDUV or large displacement,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
UV, to step in to help with the LDUV. Back in July of 2023, we issued a CSO, which is our kind of unique process for that. In August, so just a month later, and this is really the way that we do this, which is about kind of turning things on its head. It's not a 300-page requirements document, right? It's a very simple response. Might only be a 10-page PowerPoint or a couple-page memo that says, hey, here's how we think our tech from the commercial tech sector can solve for that critical problem. By August, we were looking at those different results, down selected to a smaller number. In I believe October, November of that same year, we were looking then at concrete possible solutions with folks actually having to have their solutions swimming
yeah,
that show us what they could do. And then in February of that year, DIU awarded 3 prototype contracts, which is critical, not just one, because you want to maintain competition and action, just like happens in the tech sector, right up until the moment that the customer buys. But had 2 or 3 plus, you've got sometimes different use case missions out there for the solution. So awarded that to 3 different companies in early 2024. By summer 2024, we were working with the Navy, and I was actually looking at out in Hawaii for the kind of initial kind of operational testing of a prototype that was live with the Navy team, the Pac Fleet team, and the DIU team, and the contractor team to be kind of looking at that thing. And then we used our flexible funding to help the Navy, while the Navy was also stepping in with their own kind of funding to begin putting some of those first boats out there with an intent to have live operational capability beginning by this coming summer, right? And so what that means is when you get that right, you go from the prototype that DIU would have always helped with and helped to fund in year one to beginning to actually put those initially fielded prototypes out there, including all the way to operational testing with operational units, could happen in year one. We're doing this right now in some other programs with the Navy, as well as the Army and the Air Force. And then in year two, we may continue to help as the service begins to move their more flexible funds, maybe through a reprogramming action to help begin scaling that activity. And if we've partnered on it correctly, without getting ahead of any presidential budget discussions, if we partner on those things the right way, even under today's complicated budgeting process, which I hope we do come back to, they can be palming for that back in year one, so that by year three they're scaling. And if we get that right, we can cross the valley together.
So the example that you gave of the unmanned systems with the Navy is really a terrific example. We even saw that at NPS. We had 3 of our students worked with a small company startup, worked with DIU, did some unmanned work. It was done through all the means that you are talking about, and then frankly, they were noticed by a couple of companies, and their work has now continued. And it's been great work that we've been working with them, and as well as with DIU. You wanted to talk about budget. So one of the things that the unmanned example gives us, though, and you said it, was that it's constantly evolving up to the point of either purchase or employment, whatever. So how does the Navy or any of the services deal with the budget cycles and how it works and the continuous changes that go on now in innovation? How do you take that friction in the budget process and make it work so that it is accountable, that Congress sees things, but that it moves to the pace and speed of need?
Yeah. So, wow, there's a lot in there. Maybe I'll touch on first. I'll touch base on that point about Congress, and I'll because I was just talking about kind of the flexible budget.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is a really critical piece of this is that Congress has given us enormous trust at DIU. That colorless money that I talked about is unique right now at DIU.
Yeah.
We're the only ones who have that in quite that way. And along with that enormous trust comes a level of transparency that is also unique. So I've got a spreadsheet effectively of every single thing that we're working on at DIU, what line of funding it kind of comes from, who we're working on it with, and where that is in the process and how's it going. And I share effectively the same tool with Congress, and not like once a year, but like on a every couple of weeks or monthly basis, right up to kind of their appetite to be able to even look at it. And we don't publish that, but we share it with because some of it is confidential. Obviously, Congress isn't seeing the parts that they can't see, like the names of individual companies before they've been awarded and things like that. But where we are in those programs, up until the moment of award and then after the moment of award, everything that we share, we just share that. And that's because transparency is tied to trust, and trust is tied to transparency. And I really do think that's a very critical part of the dynamic that is going to need to change. Second thing I want to touch on is you talk about kind of the pace of change. And unmanned systems is a great way to think about this. Like, just think about what's going on in Ukraine right now. And I was there in December, and what you see there in this constant battle, literally, of innovation and counter innovation in unmanned systems and counter unmanned systems, ranging all the way from, first person view drones to things that are more sophisticated, and the EW environment in which they're operating is is truly eye-watering. So that technology that works today may not work anymore in 1 or 2 weeks. And that cycle of speed would be daunting, even if you were looking at it from the commercial tech universe, right? But if you look at it from kind of our traditional kind of cycle of change in the department, it just doesn't work, right? And so our ability to kind of move dramatically faster is a critical part of this. And to give a sense of just how bonkers our current setup is, this is a setup that was built in a way in response to many years, really 70 years of development of a set of processes and tools to protect against about concerns about financial risk and other forms of risk, which are all critical and that we have to manage for. But in an environment where the technology wasn't moving anything like the speed that a lot of this technology moves. And so if you were to kind of do an analogy here, I'm going to do an analogy from the world that I used to come from. So if for example, let's just pretend like let's pretend that you're going to go and buy a new smartphone, and just for simplicity's sake, I'll say it's an iPhone just so I can use the analogy there. But to be clear, I'm not making any kind of suggestion about that. But the way that we do this in the department right now is today you could go down to an Apple retail store or wherever and you could buy an iPhone 16. The way we do it in the department is we will have been playing with the technology for 2 or 3 years. So that might be an iPhone 13 that you've been playing with for 2 or 3 years to decide whether we've kind of ironed out all the risks and concerns about it. Now, there are certain areas where you have to do that because of the real risks that maybe there are a lot of areas where you really don't. And we'd be playing with that piece of hardware for 2 or 3 years. And then in the year that iPhone 16 was out, we would decide that we wanted to buy an iPhone 13. We would then put in an order for that device, right? And that order, because of the way our budgeting process works, would be an order that we would be at best receiving 2 years later.
That's right.
So now you put in an order for technology that's already maybe 3 years old, and you're not going to get it for 2 years. So that's when maybe the iPhone, I don't know, I'm not going to think ahead to what Apple may or may not wind up issuing someday, but let's just say there's an iPhone 18 that's out there, or maybe even iPhone 19, depending on the timing, that's out now. And that's when the iPhone 13 first begins arriving. Now, what if you got to buy a bunch of them for your whole family, and so you just get the first one that year and the second, and the rest of them arrive in the years that come after across what we call the FIDIP? You could be buying iPhone 13s out there in a year when your first ones are when iPhone 18's out, but you're buying like iPhone 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever might be available, but you're still buying iPhone 13. And it's actually hard to make that change. Even if you want to, you got to go back to Congress and do a reprogramming and ask, but it's hard, right? And so that's something that I think we need to fundamentally change the way that we think about, because we're talking about technology that actually moves far faster than that smartphone technology moves in many cases, not slower. And so that's something we've got to change. Tools like the flexible funding that DIU has are critical tools for making those changes. And I would dramatically accelerate and expand the ability for organizations like DIU to do them, as well as providing some of those same tools with some of the same flexibility to the services, together with the same transparency that I was just talking about, or whatever the appropriate kind of version of that is. And so I think that's really about moving from our traditional programs of record and the way that we think about them to something that looks more like a portfolio of record, where Congress is authorizing a certain amount of funding in a specific category with the ability to move within that. with enormous flexibility for the service. So the service can then say, you know what, I don't want that drone anymore. I want this drone, or I don't want that variant of that drone anymore. I want this variant of that drone. And I want the best that's available now.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a it could be a massive change. It may be hard to do that across everything, but at least in this area of
Right.
critical technology, and we know what those critical areas are around unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, critical space-based technologies. You know, some of the areas I talked about before, and those areas of very rapidly moving technology, I think we've got to go down that path.
Yeah, I mean your thinking just gets my mind going about the complexity of bringing scale to that dynamic, and then to the timing, the phasing, then the development and the creation. There's an exquisite complexity there that you're working to master, and I think it is extraordinarily important work. Let's get to something I think that you have a great deal of passion also. So when I went and visited DIU 2.0, I was really taken by the talent that was inside the organization, and I enjoyed very much my visits with a number of the folks there. But and you are even more building a unique talent makeup with both operators and industry and the executives in both. How are you sharing lessons learned and bringing those two worlds together for talent management? And how can people learn more about your processes and your practices? You are really good at this and you have passion about it. Tell us how you would look at talent management and yet the integration of the operators and the and industry.
Okay, so you're right. That's another area that I'm super passionate about. So I'm glad you asked the question. And you at NPS play a critical role in the development of the kind of talent that I'm about to talk about. And I think there are a couple of flavors of talent that we're talking about, and when you get them all right, you've got kind of that perfect sweet spot. DIU is really built and has been from the very, very beginning on the concept of dual fluency talent. Um, and that talent capability is really about people who speak fluent warfighterese and fluent tech sectorese and can bring those worlds together. Now, some of those people come from a military background and are now out in the tech sector. Some of them may come from the tech sector and now they've spent time in the department. Some of them may be reservists and live in both worlds. And as you know, I'm a huge fan, and this may be a bit parochial of those dual fluency folks who are kind of twice a citizen and living in both these worlds, but they really do play an important role. There's all different flavors of how we kind of build that talent, but there are a lot of those people out there now, and that really is at the heart of what we're talking about. And I think so. I'm going to talk about that for 1 second. I want to come back in particular to another flavor of talent, which I think is about a third fluency that we've got to get to even more. And actually, one of our teammates at DIU is a part-timer with us, as well as a leader in her own right. Amy Probasco talks a little bit about trilingualism, which I want to come back to in a second. So the first thing is we need to develop far more dual fluency folks, right? So people who speak these two languages. Now that's partly about encouraging the right people inside the department to maybe come into places like DIU, get that experience. It also is about the people who choose to leave, maybe catching as many as we can in kind of the reserve force and getting them involved. It also means tapping into that unbelievable network of our alumni, effectively from the department, which are veterans who are out there seeding and populating the most innovative companies and the most innovative investors in the world, who are desperate to help with the mission. So part of what we got to do is just activate that whole community. Second, we need to build more of those people. and rotate them through experiences in the different pieces. So more, far more, and this is one of the things you and I have been talking about, right? More effectively fellowship programs that allow for folks to go and have a time, maybe spend a year at a place like DIU and then go back, which brings me to kind of the third thing, which we need to incent those people. We need to make sure that somebody who comes and spend a year or so somebody who's an amazing warfighter, right? Whether they fly planes or drive submarines or whatever they do for a living, that they can come to a place like DIU, have a year helping shape and deliver the very best tech and learning how that works. And then they may go back to that community afterwards. So they might decide to get out and go do something else in that world. They may decide to go down an acquisition path, or a programmatic kind of path, or they may go back and to their warfighter and take command and whatever, because you want those people in all places. In the same way that today, once upon a time, we had a hard time creating joint officers, then we were forced to do so. Today,
Yeah.
we should similarly be able to, in the same way that we might have, somebody sitting around CNO's table as one of the key encodes, who's got a PhD from Harvard that they went and got, and also is one of the best warfighters in the fleet. I would love it if someday sitting around that table were people who were simultaneous one of the best warfighters in the fleet and who had direct experience with intersecting with the tech sector and increasing our porosity of the ability of people like that to serve and then protecting those careers and helping to promote the people who have that capability, so that somebody around that table can really help the whole team to move ahead. I think moves the ball a lot. I also would love to increase the porosity of people to come in and out of active duty, right? Or people make it easier for the very, very best talent from the civilian tech sector to come help us. Today, it's hard, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard. People are willing. I've got a list as long as my arm of people who would be willing to come into the department and help us with these critical problems,
Yeah.
but you're not willing to wait a year and a half, right? Well, put their lives on for you and have to be able to make that work. So they might be willing to take a 99.5 or whatever percent pay cut to come do it, but they're not willing to wait for a year and a half while they put their lives on hold. We've got to make all that way easier. And then I know I'm going long on this one because I'm so passionate, but I want to touch on the other piece of capability, which is that tri-fluency. And I think this is a critical piece, that we've got to help to build and expand the folks in our acquisitions world who really understand this space, can help lead around it. I have been incredibly impressed with the capability and the patriotism of our acquisitions community. And I've been simultaneously very impressed with the energy that so many of them have for how to kind of learn about and incorporate these. So we got to increase that aperture. So we have, for example, what is today a pretty small program at DIU in partnership with the Defense Acquisition University that's called ICAP. It's about bringing talent into DIU from the acquisition world. They spend like a year with us and they go back. I would love to like 10 or 100x those kinds of programs to give more and more and more people the sort of experience so that they can learn how this stuff works, help us shape it, help us do it, and then go back and do it, and also train each another 10 or 100 people so that eventually of the entire acquisition community who are all experts in this space. So it's not a special secret sauce that folks at DIU are like, we should still be pressing the bounds of it, just like the National Mission Force and other areas can push the bounds, but it should be capability that everybody has. And I'd love to do more of that. I also think that this gets back to the point of risk that you asked about. We've got to change the incentives, because today, those people inside that community who are trying to do the right thing, we structure the incentives for them so it's hard. Like they've got to take a ton of personal career risk sometimes to do the right thing. And we've got to change that dynamic so that the incentives are there to help them do the right thing, because they want it, right? They want to use the best tools. They want to move fast. They want to get the very best capability in the hands of the warfighter. They want to do that. And we've got to help give them not just the tools, but also the incentives so that they're rewarded for taking those risks in the right ways at the right times, and for protecting us from the wrong kind of risks.
So your passion on this is so authentic. I know that we need to cut off a little bit early because you got other things that you're pressing to do, but I'm going to ask you to extrapolate a bit more. You and I have talked about how the NPS DIU association and partnership can help to be factors in these changes. So rather than my voice on this, I think that hearing your voice on how you see that, and then maybe you and I can go on a road show or do an article about this, because I think that you got this down really well. So would you give, as one of your last comments, prior to giving us your last comments, your thoughts about how we at NPS and DIU can partner? And I'm on board with where you are in general. I think we just need to work out what all of that means. So would you share that with us for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I mean, and first of all, I want to thank you for the partnership that we already have. We've got an MOU between NPS and DIU. We already do collaborate, as you mentioned, on a number of things. And as you and I have talked about a lot, I think we can take that to a whole other level. And I might flip it around to you and see what else you think we should do.
Yeah.
But I think I could think of two, big areas that I'd
Yeah.
pull the lever on. One is I think that we could be working far more together to leverage NPS as kind of effectively a test bed for some of the capabilities that are that we're working on, and kind of activate that investment that the Navy's made there, particularly in some of those areas where there's so much expertise already at NPS, and that intersection with the fleet. So as we think about, I put my Navy hat on for a second, we think about kind of like what it takes to truly operationalize a mock and make that work. How do you actually take that to the next level? So there's a piece around that, and then I really think this talent piece is huge. And so I would like to have kind of a whole suite of lines of effort of ways that we might be able to partner together to help to increase the aperture of the expertise, whether it's tech sector fluent / warfighter fluent talent of that dual fluency capability, or whether it's kind of, fluency in that space plus acquisition and scaling and fielding intersection talent that allows us to work together on how we continue to build the bench and build the Navy's role in building that bench for both the Navy and for the Joint Force.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are I'm on board with all that good thinking, and we have to sit down and have that dialogue. You and I have talked about thinking about a talent pipeline differently, and what that means and how we would go about doing that within the innovation space. We've talked about the Naval Innovation Center with DIU inside, making that pipeline actually work so that the Navy and the military can see it to their equities, as well as DIU to your equities, and then that is national equity. And so working with that, I think that we could also talk about being some sort of a test bed for all of the things that you're having to look at, and helping with that. That also serves the greater good. But this is where you have stimulated and really provoked some new thinking, Doug. And I want to thank you. ARP has many opportunities to talk to great people, and this is one of those opportunities. And to listen to you, to hear you talk about these things with enthusiasm and optimism, and not with a sense of labor, but with a sense of energy, is just terrific for all of us who are in the acquisition and in the learning and in the technology worlds. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for your leadership, for your press forward, for your courage about doing things differently, which then inspires us. So Doug, on behalf of ARP and NPS and all of us who are audiences and listening to you either live or later on video, thank you for your leadership and for you helping us to pace the way toward a better and richer and healthier future. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for having me. And I might just close by saying,
the imperative here for us to get this right for our nation could not be stronger. And it's going to take all of us, warfighters, acquisitions folks, companies, investors, all the other experts. Well, it's going to take all of us working together. And that teamwork is what makes America great. And I'm just very, very proud to be a small part of that team.
Have a good day, sir, and thank you. I thank you again.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion.